Hello and welcome to my session on cognition and learning. My name, as you are aware, is Jo Haines and I'm a senior educational psychologist with Bradford Council. It was lovely to see you all a few weeks ago on the Person-Centred Planning Day. Today I will divide the session into two. In the first half of the session I will look at developing an understanding of what we mean by cognition and learning. I will briefly touch on theories of cognitive development and learning. This will lay a foundation for considering the difficulties that some children and young people will experience in this area of their development and functioning. In the second half of the presentation, I will look more closely at cognition and learning as it is defined within the Code of Practice and the graduated response. I will introduce some of the approaches to identifying and assessing children with cognition and learning needs, and also the special educational provision to meet their needs. So, hopefully, by the end of the session, everyone will understand the range of needs related to cognition and learning. You will have been introduced and revisited theories and models related to cognitive development. You will understand the principles and practice of high quality teaching, quality first teaching. You will understand how to support pupils with cognition and learning needs within a graduated response. You will know where to find out more about interventions. So before moving on, let's have a look at some facts and figures. I have pulled out some basic data from the January 2021 census on special educational needs in schools in England. As you can see, pupils with moderate learning difficulties make up approximately 10% of pupils with an education, health and care plan. This is similar for pupils with severe learning difficulties. Children with profound and multiple learning difficulties and specific learning difficulties make up about 3 to 4% of the total of pupils with an education, health and care plan. In relation to pupils at SEN support, there are more pupils with moderate learning difficulties and specific learning difficulties. Added together, these two broad groups represent approximately a third of pupils at SEN support. Ensuring high quality provision for these pupils is in place across all schools is key in your role as Senco. As you can see, only a small number of pupils with severe learning difficulties and profound and multiple learning difficulties are there within the SEN support category. This is because their needs are high and they will likely have an education, health and care plan in place quite early in their education. I'll provide some further clarity on what we mean by moderate learning difficulty, severe learning difficulty and so on later in the presentation. So as this presentation is about cognition and learning, let's have a think about what we mean by learning. Learning is essentially the acquisition of knowledge or skills through study, experience, or being taught. It has a number of stages, and here you can see a graphic of the learning hierarchy, Haring and Eaton, 1978. At the acquisition stage, a child or young person learns a new task. At the fluency stage, a person learns to perform the task with a high degree of accuracy, moving to independence. The person then learns to generalize the skill to other situations and environments, and at the adaptation stage, the learner applies the skill to a new area of application without that direct teaching and guidance. I find it quite a useful model to think of when thinking of how children and young people learn new skills and develop them. Moving on to this slide here, we can see exactly what we mean by cognition. So what do we mean? Cognition is the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience and the senses. It is about the ability to perceive, and react, process, understand, store and retrieve information. It's about making decisions and producing appropriate responses. It is about thinking, and it includes perception and attention, memory, language and problem solving. On this slide here, I've summarized some of the key cognitive processes. As you can see, they form a hierarchy or building blocks, with some of the earliest processes at the bottom developing through to more complex processes such as executive functions and social and emotional competency. I've taken this from a website called Colorado Kids with Brain Injury. It is an American website and for children with brain injuries, but I just thought it was a really helpful graphic, and I have hopefully hyperlinked it. So you should be able to click on it and go to the website and just explore those in more detail there. Cognition is a developmental process, and it's extremely useful to have a thorough understanding of how typical cognition develops in order to know whether a child or young person has a particular delay or difficulty. In looking at this slide here, you can see some of the key developmental milestones that children go through from the earliest stages. At the earliest stage, cognition is essentially a sensory motor process. Notably, one of the key areas of cognitive development is the development of a child's interest in faces, cueing into faces, especially of key adults, caregivers at an early stage is really important to the development of social interaction, communication and language skills. Some children struggle to develop this skill, for example, children with specific communication and interaction needs. Looking down the list here, you can see the complexity of skills that children begin to develop. They begin to problem solve, to build, to match, and to understand cause and effect. All of this is underpinned by language and communication. At the bottom of this page here, I've included a reference to a book which is a number of years old now, but continues to be a really relevant text for those wanting to know about child development in the early years. So in this slide here, you can see that by the age of 3, typically developing children will have developed a range of complex skills, from doing puzzles with 3 or 4 pieces, building towers, playing with make-believe, working toys with buttons. Cognition and learning are inextricably linked, and there are a number of theories and approaches, and I have listed them on this slide here for you. Behaviorism. It sees learning as developing through reinforcements and consequences. Cognitive approaches see learning as occurring through the internal processing of information. Constructivism is based on the theory that learners create meaning through their experiences and interactions with others. Humanistic approaches to learning are based on principles of humanism and notably the work of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. At the centre is the learner as an individual. In this approach, learning is about educating the whole person and taking their interests, goals and motivations into account. It is student-centered, and learners take responsibility for their own learning and are intrinsically rather than extrinsically motivated. Feelings and knowledge are both important to the process. And a key goal is towards the development of self-actualization, where a person's full potential is achieved. The educator's role within this process is as facilitator. So, as you can see, I think you will see how many of the approaches and methods we use in the classroom draw upon all of these approaches, not just one exclusively. On this slide here, you see some of the key theories related to constructivism. Piaget in the middle adopted a cognitive constructivist approach and is probably very familiar to those working in early years. Vygotsky on the left and Bruner on the right adopted a social constructivist approach. I put a link to a website so you can explore them in more detail. But just going back to Vygotsky, again, many of you will be familiar with his work as he proposed the idea of the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development being the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can achieve with guidance and encouragement. Essentially, the skills that are too difficult to master independently can be done with guidance and encouragement from adults or more knowledgeable others. Scaffolding is a key concept, which again many of you will be familiar with, and was introduced by Jerome Bruner. Like Vygotsky, he was a social constructivist and emphasized the social nature of learning. Scaffolding essentially refers to the helpful and structured interaction between adult and child. The help from adult decreases until the learner can do a task or skill independently. The aim of it is to achieve a specific skill or goal. I'd like to finish looking at the theories of development with looking at Uri Bronfenbrenner and his bioecological model of development. Bronfenbrenner's theory was that child development is a complex system of relationships affected by multiple layers of the surrounding environment, from immediate settings to broader cultural values, laws and customs. He saw that an individual develops and is shaped by interactions between them and their environment over time. The microsystem and mesosystem, perhaps within the immediate context, being the most influential, as it contains the most immediate surroundings for the developing child, including the family and school. Before I finish this first half of the presentation, I'd like to go right back again to the early years. The Early Intervention Foundation is a charity aimed at improving outcomes for children. In 2018, it published evidence on how best to support children's cognitive development in the early years. The review highlighted the importance of 4 key competencies as being critical in children's overall development, and these were language development, understanding of objects, understanding of people, understanding of numbers. The report identified the factors which support the development of these early competencies and also the factors which place the development of these at risk. You might want to refer to this later in order to further your understanding of early cognitive development. The report is useful as it gives us a summary of the principles and assumptions that underpin early cognitive development, and these are, firstly, that it is never just a case of nurture or nature. Cognitive development is the result of interdependent processes of the child's genetic makeup and environment. Children are born with a set of competencies which facilitate their learning, but learning is also shaped by their family, community, culture and society. Again, it's drawing upon the ideas of Bronfenbrenner. There's the age-related progression in cognitive development, as we've already seen. Another principle is that children play an active role in their own cognitive development. Cognitive capabilities at early points of development are predictive of capabilities at later points, and the strength of these associations increase over time. However, and this next bit is really important. It is important to understand cognitive development is nevertheless malleable. Stable individual trajectories can and do change when the child's circumstances change. Changes in circumstances can include the availability of effective interventions. I feel this is where you as Sencos can really have an important part to play. So making sure that for children who are struggling, who need additional help with their learning, that they do have their availability of effective interventions in order that they can make that progress. I suggest at this point maybe you take a pause, pause the presentation and have a break, and perhaps reflect on some of the things that we've discussed so far. So welcoming you back to the second half of the presentation, I'd just like to finish by start by referring you to a link to the document we were talking about just before the break in relation to the development of early competencies. That is there at the bottom of the page in that link. So moving on, I'll now look at cognition and learning within the Code of Practice. So let's have a look at what the code says in relation to cognition and learning. Chapter 6 of the code outlines the 4 broad areas of need, of which cognition and learning is one. Specifically 6.30 and 6.31. The code says support for learning may be required when children and young people learn at a slower pace than their peers, even with appropriate differentiation. So key there is making sure that we have appropriate differentiation for children who need it. Learning difficulties cover a wide range of needs, including moderate learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, and profound and multiple learning difficulties. In addition, there are what are referred to as specific learning difficulties, which affect one or more aspects of learning. For example, this encompasses a range of conditions such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. I'll talk about these now in more detail. Pupils with moderate learning difficulties are likely to have attainments that are well below expected levels in all or most areas of the curriculum, and despite having had appropriate interventions still have more difficulty than their peers in acquiring basic skills in literacy and numeracy and understanding concepts. They might also have associated speech and language delays. Often they'll have low levels of self-esteem, or sometimes low levels of self-esteem and underdeveloped social skills. Often they can have difficulties with concentration and attention. Pupils with learning difficulties are likely to need support with understanding, instructions, requirements of tasks, developing sequencing, personal organisational skills, and they may often have difficulties with visual and auditory memory. Children with severe learning difficulties are likely to need support in all areas of the curriculum and often have additional areas of need. They'll have considerable difficulty learning new skills and applying and generalising. Sometimes they might use symbols and alternative and supported methods of communication, for example, Makaton, or symbol-based approaches. Children with severe learning difficulties might also require help developing independence, self-help, and social skills. Children with profound and multiple learning difficulties will often be learning in very small steps which focus on early development. Children with learning difficulties might be monitored against systems that are in addition or slightly different to monitoring children who are developing within age-related expectations. For example, you might be familiar with the fairly newly introduced engagement model for children who are not yet at subject-specific learning. This is probably more likely to be something used with children with profound and multiple learning difficulties. Also, children might be monitored on the pre-key stage standards. Moving on, children with specific learning difficulties include those with dyscalculia, which is typically associated with a specific difficulty in acquiring arithmetical skills, understanding basic number concepts and relationships. Dyspraxia or developmental coordination disorder is a developmental difficulty affecting fine and gross motor coordination, often planning and organisation. Children with dyslexia have continued and significant difficulties developing reading or spelling, and that is despite additional support and intervention. It usually impacts on accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. Characteristic features of dyslexia are difficulties with phonological awareness and processing, verbal aspects of verbal memory and processing speed, and it occurs across a range of abilities. In many cases, local authorities have developed specific criteria in relation to defining learning difficulties. For example, they may relate, the criteria might relate to attainment, it might relate to cognitive abilities, social and adaptive functioning, and the history and onset of the specific difficulties. The numbers and information you see here on this slide relate to Bradford locally agreed criteria in relation to definitions of learning difficulties. Other authorities may have slightly different attainment levels or scores and standardised assessments. Just having a look at those terms, moderate, severe learning difficulty. I think it's important that we don't confuse those terms with terms such as learning disability, mild, moderate learning disability. The term learning disability is usually more commonly associated with health and social care. What we are talking about here is the learning difficulties as defined by the Code of Practice. There is a lot of overlap, but I just want it to be clear that we are not referring to learning disabilities, but learning difficulties in this context. Before moving on, I'd like to just point out that whilst we do have descriptions and criteria for different types of learning difficulty, it's important we don't place young children and young people into what Dominic Griffiths refers to as SEN shoeboxes. This is where we categorise and label individuals. Unfortunately, labels tend to focus on a deficit model. Dominic Griffiths encourages to look towards strengths as well as needs and difficulties. He encourages us to think about neurodiversity, where each person is an individual and their strengths and difficulties are part of natural human variation. We're all on that continuum and variation. In fact, if you look at section 6.27 of the Code of Practice, it highlights that in identifying special educational needs, the purpose is to work out what action the school needs to take and not fit pupils into categories. So I think it's really important that whilst we are defining terms such as moderate learning difficulties, SLD, that we really think about the needs of the individual and not the category of learning difficulty. Thinking about that, the code does is underpinned by an inclusive approach to meeting the needs of children and young people, including those with cognition and learning difficulties, which is the focus of today's presentation. So Melensko noted as far back as 1999 that it's helpful to view difficulties with learners as problems for teachers to solve rather than problems with learners. And I actually think this is a really good approach to adopt when thinking of inclusive practice and supporting pupils with cognition and learning needs. Think about, as well as the barriers and their current development, think about looking at their strengths and what teaching strategies, interventions are needed. Think about how to motivate and engage them. Think about their aspirations. Again, aspirations is really important, and that is something which is emphasised within the code of practice. When thinking about children with cognition and learning difficulties, I think it's important that we do go back and think about, rather than it necessarily being a within child difficulty, that we consider whether actually they may have been impacted by a whole range of other factors which have led to the point at which their learning is not at making the same progression as other learners. For example, have they had poor quality teaching? Are they new to English? Many children new to English might quickly pick up conversational skills, but their academic, cognitive and academic language proficiency, as referred to by Cummins, may take a longer time to develop. Again, disrupted schooling. Think of the amount of disruption children have had to their education over the last 18 months and actually continue to have in terms of disruptions to schooling, mainly because children are coming back into schools and picking up all the bugs and health issues that might not have happened due to us living in such sort of clean and sterile environment. So we have more disrupted schooling. Think about the home circumstances of children and how this impacts on their learning. So, in terms of identification and assessment of pupils, and within that, cognition and learning, it's important that we refer here to the graduated approach. The graduated approach is something that will be the focus of a whole session in the new year, but just to refer to it here, the code of praxis emphasises in terms of whatever need a child has, that it's done within the context of a graduated approach. In summary, when a child is identified as having special educational needs, the code emphasises that school must take action to remove barriers to learning and put in place effective special educational provision through an assess, plan, do, review cycle. The code 6.44 indicates that each stage of the support builds on the good practice of the previous stages, leading to an approach in which increasing levels of support are provided where necessary. So for children with cognition and learning needs, you would assess, you would plan interventions, you would review and refine practice as is needed. In terms of identification and assessment, The code refers to pupils making less than expected progress given their age and individual circumstances. However, the code indicates the first response to slow progress should be high quality teaching targeted at their area of weakness. We'll come back to that shortly when we look at high quality teaching in more detail. When progress continues to be less than expected, the class or subject teacher working with the Senco should assess whether the child has SEN. So there is still within this graduated approach a significant level of responsibility for class and subject teachers with children with cognition and learning needs or any other SEN. It's not simply a case of passing to the Senco to sort out and do. So what you need to develop is really robust systems in your school which follow the graduated response for all levels of need and for children with cognition and learning needs. So I've summarised some of the methods here that you might use at this first stage of thinking, well, a child's not making progress, what do we do about it? So in terms of cognition and learning, a whole number of pieces of information might be sought. For example, you might look at teacher assessment and knowledge of pupil, data on pupils' progress, attainment and behaviour. The individual's development in comparison to peers will help you gauge where they are with their learning and development. Parent experience and views, and of course pupil views. It's important to seek pupil views as to where they consider their needs and strengths are, if appropriate to do so, or for children with complex needs, you may use alternative methods of communication. You may use visual approaches. So again, seeking pupil views is something that you would tailor and look at dependent on their individual needs. So developing a little bit more, what would you do? How might you assess a child who you thought had cognition and learning needs? You might use standardized assessments. You may use criterion, reference assessments, curriculum-based assessments, screening tools, questionnaires, computer-based. There's a whole range of ways of collecting information about children. You may refer to specialist teachers and EPs for further advice, and if this is done, it's really important that any recommendations and advice are actually embedded into plans for children. And at the bottom of the page here, I've just put a link to Bradford Specialist Teaching Services. They've developed a baseline assessment for literacy and maths based around pre-key stage standards. I'm sure many other authorities will have developed similar, but as I'm from Bradford, I've just popped a link in there to our assessments that we use. You may want to explore this in detail later. So as part of the graduated approach for children with cognition and learning, you're looking at identifying and assessing. Here I've looked at how to meet the needs of pupils with cognition and learning difficulties. So it's within the context of a graduated approach, and where a pupil has SEN, where their learning difficulty or disability calls for special educational provision, namely provision different from or additional to that normally available to pupils of the same age, making higher quality teaching normally available to the whole class is likely to mean fewer pupils require such support. So such improvements in whole class provision tend to be more effective and sustainable. So what it's saying is make sure that at the first level of any kind of support for children, you've got really good, high quality provision at a whole class level. And this will mean that some children do not require the additional and different provision. So let's think about what we mean by high quality provision, high quality teaching. In the first instance, look at differentiation for pupils. Differentiation is something that teachers, I'm sure, do every day as part of their lesson planning. Lessons are differentiated because essentially teachers are aware pupils come with a range of skills, abilities and different needs. As Senco, it's really important to remind teachers of these basic principles underpinning meeting the needs of children with cognition and learning needs, and of course other needs. You might want to use the information on these slides here as a bit of an aid memoir that you can give to teachers and say, right, make sure that across the school, before we think about further assessment and further interventions, we've got these things in our class to remove the barriers and enable children to make progress. So here again, some more approaches to differentiation. In terms of high quality teaching strategies, I've drawn this from a document, sengateway.org resources, SEN support, research evidence on effective approaches and examples of current practice in good and outstanding schools. So this document draws together a whole lot of information about good practice generally within schools, and also good practice and evidence-based practice for more looking at more targeted and specific approaches. So in here, I'm referring to the higher quality teaching strategies in general and for children with cognition and learning needs. So higher quality teaching, think about teaching memory strategies. That's been shown to be effective. Regular practice of what has been taught plus new materials is an effective approach. Make sure systematic phonics-based reading instruction, again key stage 1 and 2, has been shown to be effective for all children and should be the foundations on which we're basing provision for children with a range of learning needs as well. Explicit teaching of reading comprehension strategies, again another effective approach. Teaching, planning, monitoring and evaluation of own work has been found to be effective, and perhaps slightly obvious, reducing noise levels in the classroom will support children. Using teaching assistants when the teaching assistants are well trained and have a specific role is effective for supporting pupils. Some general higher quality teaching strategies to support pupils and those with cognition and learning needs, practical and interactive activities, breaking down learning into smaller steps, make sure there's clear, simple instructions, teach the meaning of new and specialist vocabulary. So these again you could have as some sort of checklist that teachers need to refer to and ensure that all these things are in place before you begin to put in any more additional and specialist intervention. Here again, I've just put some visuals, the types of things that you might use for children with cognition and learning needs or other needs, or just general good practice for most pupils in class. For example, knowledge organisers. You might want to simplify those for children with ranges and degrees of learning difficulty, but they still form a useful visual timetables, again, can be used. To support pupils, task planners, mind maps are really good, high quality teaching for support approaches for teaching, for supporting pupils with cognition and learning needs. Again, I do like visuals, and here we've got the reading pen. We have talking tins here, which can be used for a number of things, from teachers giving instructions and the child being able to record, to listen back if they struggle with remembering. Again, children can talk into the tins, and they may want to put in simple phrases or sentences that they could use to play back and support them when they're doing written work. Down the left hand side of this, you'll see a number of resources that are useful. Phonics charts, high frequency words. Make sure that children have access to these. They may need them to be personalised and actually on their desk or working station. In maths, make sure concrete objects are used. Teach mathematical vocabulary. Ensure links to prior learning are made. Provide many worked examples. So again, these are a good, solid approaches for all children, as well as those with cognition and learning needs. You may want to think about the resources that you have linked to maths. Again, really visual, practical, visual timetables, counting equipment, etc. Whiteboards to have a go. Colour coding to support organisation. So all of those again are basic approaches and strategies you might use. So through your graduated approach, you might feel that in addition to those, you need some more targeted and specific interventions for meeting the needs of children with cognition and learning needs. I can't go through them all today, but if you look at the document, the Sen Gateway document I referred to earlier, this will give you evidence bases for a range of approaches and interventions in each of the 4 areas, and cognition and learning as well. And here I've just put a few of the interventions that have been found to be at least good in relation to cognition and learning. So they're looking at literacy. You can see multi-component small group literacy teaching for key stage 1, 2 and above has been found to be effective in terms of targeted approaches. This is now looking at the additional approaches that you would, and interventions on top of your high quality teaching. What is not effective is also included, which is helpful. So coloured overlays to improve reading other than for diagnosed conditions such as Erland syndrome. So if there's a reason for a coloured overlay, children should be provided with a coloured overlay, but just simply giving a child a coloured overlay in itself is not necessarily going to improve reading unless, as said, there's a specific need for it. I put a link there to a really comprehensive set of information related to literacy interventions. So interventions for literacy.org.uk. So if you're looking for specific interventions focused around reading, spelling, reading comprehension, etc., do go on that website. You can put in searches for, you can streamline the searches. You know, you might be looking for a particular intervention on spelling for a particular age group, so you can filter the information, and it will you will be it will lead you to the interventions that have been and their evidence base. So that website is quite useful for searching out interventions for literacy. In terms of targeted and specific interventions for maths, going back to the same gateway document, structured maths tuition has been found to be effective. Again, computer games to teach counting at key stage 1 and 2, and computer-based teaching at key stage 3 and 4, alongside individualized tuition. If you explore that document in detail, you'll find the effectiveness of other approaches. And I would recommend that you do spend some time looking at that, because it's important that whatever you put in place in school, targeted interventions need to be evidence-based. At the bottom of the page, I put a link to a document which is on the National Archives, some years old now, but it's What Works for Children with Mathematical Difficulties. It still contains a detailed relevant information for supporting children with difficulties in this area. And if you click on the whole link, you will be able to find this document. So you may want to explore that if you're thinking about putting in place interventions related to maths. On this page here, I've just put some links to a number of websites and information that you might find useful. For example, the Down Syndrome.org, Dyslexia SPLD Trust, the Welsh Government documentation Routes for Learning. That's quite a detailed document for pupils with PMLD. So yeah, do feel free to have a look at those and explore those sites for further information and guidance. I've come to the end of the presentation today, so hopefully in the second half we've looked at definitions of learning difficulties in the Code of Practice. We've considered the sort of various learning difficulty types, moderate learning difficulties, etc. We've considered, when we're thinking about identifying a cognition and learning need, whether we need to think about other things as well. What else could it be? We've had a look at the principle of a graduated approach, and in the first instance, the first response to meeting need would be making sure that high quality teaching is available for all children. And then we've moved on to some targeted and specific interventions and the evidence base for them. We've considered briefly some of the assessments that you might undertake for assessment of children, and I linked you to one of our local assessments that we use in Bradford for more curriculum-based assessments linked to pre-key stage standards. So that brings to a conclusion this presentation today, and I look forward to presenting you the graduated response presentation in the new year. Thank you.